Evelyn Hale, a name synonymous with compassion, stood as an American icon, the founder of a sprawling international children's relief organization, a recipient of dozens of awards. She was revered by politicians, business magnates, and the global public. Her legendary TED Talks always ended with the same resonant phrase, "Every child deserves a home." She spoke with a crystalline clarity and an apparent sincerity that could move mountains of corporate wealth and public opinion. Yet, for 27-year-old Mara, every time she saw Evelyn's face on a screen or a billboard, a strange, cold knot tightened in her chest. Mara was one of the adopted children who had come through Evelyn's renowned foundation. According to the official documentation, she had been rescued from an unspecified disaster zone. At the tender age of 2, Mara had grown up feeling deeply, perpetually indebted to this woman, this organization that had supposedly plucked her from the brink and given her a chance at a meaningful existence. She had carried the story of her rescue like a badge of honor, a compelling narrative that proved the world was capable of immense good. This sense of profound obligation, however, was always shadowed by a persistent, vague sense of displacement, a feeling that the narrative she was living didn't quite fit the void where her earliest memories should have been. She had always convinced herself that this was the common, manageable anxiety of an adopted child, burying the uncomfortable sensation deep beneath layers of conscious gratitude and public praise for Evelyn. But the truth, relentless and uncompromising, was waiting for a chance to surface. The catalyst was mundane and administrative, a routine request for her pre-adoption medical records, needed for a new, exhaustive health insurance policy. The standard documents were readily available, confirming her identity, her adoption date, and the Foundation's involvement, all the surface-level details. But the search for the original medical intake file, the one detailing her condition at the exact point of rescue, the evidence of the trauma she was saved from, hit a dead end. It was simply missing. Mara, trusting in the Foundation's vast infrastructure, filed a formal inquiry with the Archives Department. The reply, when it finally came, was a sterile, 2-sentence email that landed on her screen like a physical blow, its clinical tone amplifying the shock. The requested medical records do not exist. Furthermore, we must clarify that your adoption was not categorized under rescue. The digital ink of those words was barely visible, but the meaning was devastatingly clear, slicing through 2 decades of belief. Not rescue. The Foundation that built its entire, shimmering image on saving children had explicitly stated that she was not one of them. Mara looked at her framed adoption certificate, the document she had cherished for 25 years, now feeling alien and false. A sudden, sickening thought took root and bloomed into an absolute terror. She was not a child who had been saved from disaster. She might have been something else entirely. The realization was a cold, alien presence in her life, forcing her to question the very foundation of her identity, her past, and her purpose. If she wasn't rescued, what was she? The official narrative was a meticulously crafted lie, and every public speech, every golden award Evelyn Hale had ever received, now echoed with a terrifying, hollow falsehood. Mara knew she couldn't risk asking the Foundation directly again. The email was not a clarification, it was a digital curtain pulled shut, a silent and absolute warning. She needed to look behind the curtain herself. Mara reached out to an old university friend, Alex, a computer science prodigy with a penchant for digital mischief and an ethical aversion to corporate opacity. She explained the situation with careful, measured words, trying to keep the raw panic from her voice. Alex, intrigued by the sheer audacity of an organization as public and powerful as Evelyn's attempting to hide anything, agreed instantly to help, working in a tight, nervous silence over multiple encrypted channels. They spent 2 days systematically bypassing the Foundation's complex and expensive security layers. Mara, guided by Alex, navigated the internal server structure, the labyrinth of files and databases that chronicled the lives of thousands of adopted children. She located the Deep Archive folder, where sensitive, non-public case files were stored, the digital graveyard of inconvenient truths. She typed in her unique adoption code, the one printed on the official certificate that now felt like a forgery. 47B. The file snapped open, instantly shattering the remainder of her childhood illusion. Case ID 47B. Private acquisition, not rescue, not transfer, not shelter. The word was cold, clinical, and terrifyingly transactional. Acquisition. Mara stared at the screen, the word pulsing with an awful, unsaid meaning. She was not a survivor pulled from the wreckage of a life. She was an item, a possession, a transaction. Scrolling down the file, her gaze, fixed and burning on a small, hastily typed memo buried beneath lines of bureaucratic code. Payment complete. Child will be delivered to Ms. Hale at 0940. A delivery, like a package ordered online, a piece of inventory, a purchased good. The sterile language was a form of psychological violence. Mara felt the air leave her lungs. She slumped back, the chair groaning beneath her. She hadn't been rescued from a disaster zone in a foreign land. She had been bought, purchased, the charitable narrative that defined Evelyn Hale's life, and consequently Mara's, was nothing more than a meticulously constructed facade, designed to attract donations. The price of her life, Mara now understood with a sickening certainty, was not measured in love, compassion, or humanitarian effort, but in cold, hard dollars and cents. The worst was yet to come. The file held one more detail, a final, cryptic note that added a layer of profound, painful mystery and betrayal. Tucked away at the bottom of the digital page was the sentence, "Mother requests confidentiality." Mother? Not the biological parent, who had supposedly perished in the disaster that made her an orphan. This was the one who had signed the documents, the one who had executed the agreement, the one who had willingly initiated the transaction, the person who had sold her. Mara's mind spun, consumed by a single, agonizing question that overshadowed all others. Who was this woman, and how could a mother sell her own child to an organization masquerading as a savior? The initial shock morphed into a cold, directed fury. She was no longer angry at her circumstance, she was incandescently angry at the lie, the woman who propagated it, and the woman who had initiated the transaction. She was no longer a grateful adoptee, she was a detective on a mission to reclaim the terrifying, ugly truth of her origin. The key was the contract, hidden deeper within the acquisition file was a scanned, low-resolution image of the original contract. The signature at the bottom was difficult to read, faded and looped. Mara spent days cross-referencing it, with records of known affiliates of the Foundation, digging into decades-old public records and news archives that were long forgotten by the general public. The name that finally surfaced was devastatingly familiar, a woman, now living under an assumed identity, who had been implicated in a notorious human trafficking ring years ago. Though the evidence was always circumstantial, preventing a full conviction, this was the woman who had executed the sale of Mara. She wasn't a victim of war or natural disaster. She was a commodity sold by a criminal, purchased by a supposed saint. Mara found the woman, whose new name was Clara, living in a dilapidated, forgotten motel on the outskirts of a desolate desert town. The air was heavy with dust, the smell of neglect, and an overwhelming sense of desperation. Clara was frail, her face a roadmap of deep lines, etched by years of guilt and hardship. Mara stood in the doorway of the tiny, cluttered room. When Clara looked up and saw Mara's face, the adult face of the child she had sold, she immediately dropped her head, a silent, absolute acknowledgement of her sin. The air hung thick with unsaid shame. "I didn't sell you because I didn't love you," Clara whispered, her voice rasping, brittle. "I sold you because she said she could give you a life I never could, a better life than what I was offering. She promised you schools and opportunities." The plea was weak, self-justifying. Mara's voice was unnervingly calm, cutting through the woman's flimsy attempt at pity. "How much? What was the exact price of my life?" Clara began to weep, her shoulders shaking violently, a wave of belated remorse washing over her. She slowly lifted 2 trembling fingers, holding them up against the dusty light. $20,000. The weight of that number, $20,000, pressed down on Mara, a ridiculous, insulting sum. Evelyn Hale, the philanthropist, the tireless advocate for children's rights, the woman who had built an international empire on the rhetoric of rescue, had acquired her first child for a sum equivalent to a down payment on a cheap car. It was a transaction, not a rescue. The realization of Evelyn's boundless hypocrisy was a physical pain, a sharp, sickening irony that made Mara feel dizzy. But the worst was yet to come. As Mara prepared to leave, the broken woman looked up again, her eyes wide with a fear that transcended her own personal guilt, a fear for others. "You're not the only one, Mara," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible, like a ghost's secret. She did it again, and again. "You were just her first sale." She had a list. Mara froze in the doorway, the single sentence changing everything. "You're not the only one." The vast, shining edifice of the Evelyn Hale Foundation suddenly took on the chilling aspect of an international black market, a highly efficient system of human acquisition. The $20,000 transaction was not an anomaly, a one-off mistake born of desperation. It was a template. It was the Foundation's core business model. Mara knew she couldn't rely solely on the Foundation's internal records anymore. They were too easily manipulated. She needed external, verifiable proof. Focusing her investigation on Evelyn's high-profile rescue missions, over the past 2 decades, Mara methodically cross-referenced the names of the adopted children, featured in the Foundation's yearly reports with international missing persons databases, police blotters, and local welfare office records in their purported countries of origin. The pattern that emerged was staggering in its consistency and cruelty. Evelyn had routinely announced the rescue of children from war-torn regions, disaster zones, and areas of political instability. These narratives were always emotional, media-savvy, and instantly boosted the Foundation's fundraising and, critically, Evelyn's political capital and influence. Yet, Mara discovered that several dozen of these high-profile children had never actually been reported missing by any legitimate agency. They hadn't vanished in the chaos of a foreign war or disaster. They had been deliberately sought out and taken from the absolute margins of society. The impoverished children of undocumented immigrant workers, the offspring of single mothers living in desperate, anonymous poverty, and children from remote, unmonitored communities, the ones most easily exploited, whose disappearance would cause the least amount of international alarm. They were children living in the protective blind spots of the world. The Foundation's dramatic rescue posters, featuring beaming children against a backdrop of manufactured devastation, were a deliberate, calculated lie. These children were never missing, they were simply poor. They were acquired. Mara found copies of their original adoption contracts, all digitized and hidden in the same deep archive folder, and every single one bore the same, chilling, 3-word phrase under the header "Case Status Private Acquisition," and the same ultimate destination instruction: deliver to Ms. Evelyn Hale. Mara finally understood the full, horrifying scope of Evelyn's operation. She wasn't saving children, she was curating them. She was selecting children who fit a specific, marketable narrative, children of a certain age, a certain look, with a story that could be dramatically spun to maximize public sympathy, and, crucially, donations and political favor. Evelyn Hale hadn't rescued these children, she had purchased them, like art pieces, to build her brand, her influence, and her political power base. The sheer cynicism of it was breathtaking, and Mara was the first. The very first acquisition that proved the system was viable, profitable, and secure. The Foundation was a glorious, worldwide monument, built entirely on stolen, purchased lives. The moment of confrontation arrived not in a shadowed corner, but in the blinding, unapologetic light of Evelyn's global headquarters, the very shrine of her boundless benevolence. Mara walked into Evelyn's vast, sun-drenched, corner office. The walls were covered in gleaming plaques, framed commendations, and photographs of Evelyn shaking hands with presidents and queens. Evelyn Hale, refined and impeccably dressed in a silk suit, paused mid-sentence on a phone call with a senator, her manufactured smile dying instantly as she recognized the cold, hard certainty in Mara's eyes. She hung up the phone slowly, a flicker of raw, undisguised panic crossing her face before she smoothly regained her practiced composure. "Mara, I wasn't expecting you. This office is for official business. You should have called my executive assistant." Mara didn't move past the threshold of the door, her presence, a silent, immovable obstacle. Her voice was steady, infused with the calm certainty of unassailable truth. "Did you ever care about the children, Evelyn? Not as a category, but as individuals? Or was it just the reputation and the political power they gave you?" Evelyn's composure finally cracked. She stepped out from behind her immense, polished desk, attempting to project authority. "I gave you a life, Mara, a privileged, safe, prosperous life. I gave all of you a life, a future none of your biological parents could have ever provided. I provided stability. Isn't that worth something? Isn't the end result what matters?" Her plea was laced with the familiar, practiced, self-serving logic of the powerful who believe their means are justified by their perceived noble ends. Mara's reply was a cold, final judgment that allowed for no negotiation. "No, because it wasn't yours to take. You commodified our lives. It was never your choice to make. No matter how much better you thought your life was, you stole us to look good." The time for talking, for moral debate, was over. Mara produced a digital file on her tablet containing copies of Clara's testimony, the meticulously compiled list of private acquisition contracts for dozens of children, and the irrefutable discrepancies in the missing persons reports. She had already forwarded the entire, devastating package to a coalition of international investigative journalists hours earlier. Within the hour, the first headline flashed across news screens around the world, igniting a global firestorm of outrage. "The children's hero is a buyer, not a savior." The world reeled, the public trust shattered. Evelyn's entire life, her legacy, her political ambitions, were instantly reduced to a massive, self-serving fabrication. Stripped of her carefully constructed narrative, Evelyn didn't weep or rage. She entered a state of profound denial. She stood in front of the flashing cameras of the assembled media, her face pale, her eyes hollow, repeating a single, desperate, futile mantra: "I saved those children. I saved them. I saved them." The glittering empire, built on the $20,000 purchase of Mara's life, and the cynical acquisition of countless others, began its inevitable, spectacular collapse. Her political friends distanced themselves, her corporate donors cut ties. The camera flashes were the final, damning fireworks of her downfall. The last image of the story is Mara, standing resolute, outside the ruin of the Foundation's sealed offices, holding a crisp copy of her original birth certificate, bearing the name her biological mother had given her, a name Evelyn had attempted to erase forever. She looked directly into the camera lens, a profound sense of self-possession and identity, finally settling over her, radiating a quiet, absolute strength. Her final words, delivered not in anger, but in the quiet, absolute clarity of truth, were the definitive reclaiming of her soul. "My life was never yours to buy.